Get ready for a deep dive into a case that'll really get under your skin. We're looking at the murder of Angela Savage, a young mother from Deerfield Beach, Florida, back in 1986.
It's a case that has so many twists and turns and starts with this really baffling mystery. Angela disappears one afternoon with her 6-month-old son, Dwayne Jr.,
And then later, baby Dwayne is found safe on a doorstep.
right, which means the person responsible for Angela's disappearance deliberately brought him back.
Chilling, right?
Absolutely. It's a detail that really adds another layer to the whole case.
So we're going to unpack how this case went cold for years, the impact on Angela's family, and the really surprising way it was finally solved.
I think people will be really shocked when they hear how this one unfolds.
Let's start with the day Angela vanished.
Chica.
It was March 17th, 1986, St. Patrick's Day.
A day that would become etched in this family's memory for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, Angela was a dedicated stay-at-home mom, taking care of her 2 kids, 5-year-old Stacy and, of course, baby Dwayne.
And Deerfield Beach back then was one of those places where everybody knew everybody. It was a small town, a tight-knit community.
So when Angela didn't show up to pick up Stacy from school, alarm bells started going off.
It was completely out of character for her.
So picture little Stacy waiting at school for her mom who never comes. She eventually just walks home on her own and finds the door unlocked, the TV's on, but there's no sign of her mom or her baby brother.
Heartbreaking.
Right. As darkness falls, the family's initial search turns into a desperate plea to the police.
Those first 48 hours in a missing person case are absolutely crucial. Every second counts. Investigators sometimes call them the 4 shifts, the time it takes for those initial police shifts to cycle through, because the early decisions they make can literally make or break the case.
And in this case, the next morning brought the news that everybody had been dreading. Angela's body was found.
It was a devastating discovery for everyone who knew her.
The crime scene was this small patch of ground not far from where she lived.
And the details of the crime scene paint a really grim picture.
Angela was shoeless, but she was clothed, which led investigators to believe that she had been redressed after she was killed.
Like someone was trying to clean up the scene?
Right. And there were signs of restraint and gagging. The medical examiner also revealed that Angela was actually 4 months pregnant.
A fact unknown to her family.
That's right. So you have to wonder, was this a crime of passion? Was it someone who knew about the pregnancy? And of course, we can't forget about baby Dwayne being found safe on that doorstep.
Such a strange detail in all of this, it really makes you think, was the killer trying to show some kind of twisted compassion? Or maybe they wanted to mislead investigators.
It's a real head-scratcher. So with all this mystery surrounding the case, suspicion naturally fell on the person closest to Angela, her fiancé, Dwayne Senior.
Makes sense, right? In cases like this, it's standard procedure to really look closely at those closest to the victim.
And there were definitely some red flags around Dwayne Senior. He insisted he was innocent, but his demeanor struck some people as a little detached. Then there's the fact that he was the only one who knew Angela was pregnant. On top of that, he failed a polygraph test.
The polygraph. Always a bit of a controversial topic, right? Because a lot of people think polygraphs are foolproof, but...
Yeah, like a magic lie detector.
Exactly. But the truth is, they're not. Polygraphs measure physiological responses. Things like your heart rate, your sweating, and those can be influenced by stress and anxiety, even if you're innocent.
So you're saying someone could fail a polygraph even if they're telling the truth?
Exactly. The results are open to interpretation, and they can't actually be used as evidence in court.
That's a good point. So despite Dwayne Senior acting kind of suspicious, the police just didn't have any physical evidence to link him to the murder. They searched his place, but they didn't find anything that incriminated him.
So the investigation hits a wall.
Right. And then there's the curious case of Larry Florence.
Ah, yes. A witness had spotted Angela with another man at a convenience store just hours before her disappearance. Turned out to be Larry Florence. And get this, he had been romantically interested in Angela, but she had rejected him.
Oof, a rejected suitor. Sounds like motive for murder right there.
It does, doesn't it? But investigators were able to quickly rule him out. Larry Florence had a solid alibi for the time of the murder, so he was cleared as a suspect.
So back to square one.
Pretty much. With Dwayne Senior still under suspicion, but no real evidence to tie him to the crime, the case started to go cold, leaving Angela's family with this huge cloud of unanswered questions hanging over them.
Just a brutal situation.
It is. Cold cases present these enormous challenges. Time fades, memories, Witnesses disappear. Evidence can deteriorate.
And not knowing what happened to your loved one has got to be just absolutely agonizing.
You're right. And in this case, Angela's family started to feel like the police had basically given up. They even began to suspect that maybe the case was being swept under the rug on purpose.
So what happened next? How did this seemingly unsolvable case take a turn? Stick with us as we dive into the second part of Angela Savage's story. We left off with Angela's case going cold, her family just desperate for answers. And years passed with no real leads, no new developments. Can you imagine that weight, that just constant not knowing?
It must have been incredibly difficult, and in this case, Angela's family felt like the police had basically given up on the case.
Adding insult to injury.
Exactly. It's like a double blow. You're dealing with this horrific loss, and then you feel like the people who are supposed to be helping you have just abandoned you.
Makes you wonder about all the cases that just slip through the cracks.
It's definitely something to think about, but in 1990, a tiny bit of hope appeared.
Like a light at the end of the tunnel.
You could say that. The Deerfield Beach Police Department ended up merging with the Broward County Sheriff's Office.
So new detectives, new resources.
Exactly. And sometimes a fresh set of eyes can make all the difference in a cold case, right?
It can't hurt. So tell me what happens when Angela's case lands on the desk of Detective Michael Bohl, the new lead investigator for the Broward County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit.
Detective Bohl, he was known for being really tenacious, and he was willing to try some unconventional things.
Like what?
He decided to try something pretty bold. He launched a billboard campaign.
A billboard for a murder case.
Yep, you heard that right. He put up this big billboard along a busy highway. You can picture it right. A photo of Angela's parents holding her picture, and the message was just, "Who murdered Angela?"
Wow, that's got to take a lot of courage for the family to put themselves out there like that.
It does, and it shows how determined they were to get justice for their daughter. They were willing to do whatever it took to keep her story in the public eye.
So did the billboard work?
Well, it didn't exactly lead to a ton of new tips, but it did keep Angela's story alive. And then, as Detective Bohl was going through the old case files, he started to notice something that had been overlooked before. There were some eerie similarities to another unsolved murder that had happened in the area.
Oh, this is where it gets interesting. Tell me about this other case.
It was a young woman named Cassandra Scott. She was found dead just 6 weeks before Angela's murder.
Same neighborhood.
Same neighborhood.
Yeah.
And get this, Cassandra was also only 17 years old, and she was 4 months pregnant.
Wow. 2 young pregnant women murdered within weeks of each other in the same area. Those are some crazy odds.
You're telling me it was way too much of a coincidence for Detective Bohl. He was sure there had to be a connection.
Makes sense, but what was the holdup? Why hadn't anyone connected these 2 cases before?
Well, there was a big problem. The official ruling on Cassandra's death was undetermined.
Undetermined. What does that mean?
Think of it this way. The medical examiner, they suspect foul play, but they just don't have enough conclusive evidence to call it a homicide.
So kind of like they know something's not right, but they can't prove it.
Exactly. And it happens more often than you might think, especially in cases like drownings or suffocations where there might not be any obvious signs of a struggle.
I see. So with that undetermined label, Cassandra's case just sat there unsolved.
Yeah, pretty much. But then in 1994, get this, 8 years after her death, there was a huge break in the case.
8 years. That's a long time.
It is, and it happened in a really unexpected way. A woman reported a domestic assault to the police. Turns out her husband, a guy named Gary Troutman, was brought in for questioning. And during the interrogation, he just comes out and confesses.
To the assault.
He confesses to the assault, but he also confesses to something way more shocking. He confesses to the murder of Cassandra Scott. He told the police that he lured her into his car with the promise of baby clothes, and then he restrained her and he assaulted her, and ultimately he strangled her to death.
Wow. That detail about the baby clothes, it's just chilling.
It really is. And of course, the detectives working on Cassandra's case immediately thought of Angela. 2 young pregnant women, both murdered by strangulation, both found in the same area.
Got to be more than just a coincidence, right?
Exactly. They were sure Gary Troutman was involved in Angela's murder too, but they had a problem. Troutman, he only admitted to killing Cassandra. He denied having anything to do with Angela's death, and there was no physical evidence at the time that directly linked him to her murder.
So close, but still so far.
Yeah.
So what happened to Troutman? Did he at least face justice for Cassandra's murder?
He did. They arrested him, and he ended up pleading guilty. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison.
25 years. Does that seem like enough for taking a young woman's life?
I know it can feel like a slap on the wrist, right? But sentencing guidelines, they can be really complex. They vary from state to state, and they take into account things like the severity of the crime, the defendant's criminal history, their potential for rehabilitation.
It's complicated.
It is, and due to those guidelines at the time, Troutman ended up being released after only serving 9 years of his sentence.
9 years.
Yeah.
That just doesn't seem right.
I know. And while he was behind bars, Angela's case remained open. Detective Bull, he was still convinced that Troutman was responsible for her death, but he needed more than just a hunch.
He needed proof.
Exactly, and that proof would come thanks to some major advancements in forensic science. Remember that semen sample that was collected from Angela's underwear?
Right.
It had been preserved as evidence, and by 2006, DNA technology had come a long way. Investigators were finally able to develop a full DNA profile from that sample.
Did it match Gary Troutman?
It did. After almost 20 years, science provided the missing piece of the puzzle that Detective Bull had been looking for. The DNA evidence, it irrefutably linked Troutman to Angela's murder.
Wow. So after all this time, finally a break in the case. What a moment for Angela's family, and for Dwayne Senior, too, who had been living under this cloud of suspicion for all those years.
Absolutely. This had to be a huge weight lifted off their shoulders. The truth was finally coming out.
So what happened next? Did they finally bring Troutman to justice for Angela's murder? So we left off with the DNA evidence finally linking Gary Troutman to Angela's murder. What happened next? Did they finally get him for this horrific crime?
They did. In 2007, they finally arrested Gary Troutman for Angela Savage's murder almost 21 years after she was killed.
I can't imagine what that moment must have been like for Angela's family, knowing that the man who had taken her from them was finally being held accountable.
Yeah, it must have been such a mix of emotions. Relief, of course, but also probably anger and sadness.
And probably a lot of frustration that it took so long.
Absolutely. But there was still this one nagging question that investigators just couldn't shake. You remember how Troutman had lured Cassandra into his car by promising her baby clothes?
Yeah, that detail stuck with me this whole time. It's so creepy.
Well, in Angela's case, only Dwayne Senior knew she was pregnant. So how did Gary Troutman know?
That is a good question. Could he have been watching her, maybe?
Learning
her routines?
That's possible. Or maybe there was some connection between the families that just never came to light.
We might never know.
We might not. Troutman has never explained how he knew about the pregnancy.
So how did the case against Troutman play out with this new DNA evidence?
Well, in 2015, facing all that evidence, he ended up pleading guilty to Angela's murder.
And what did he get?
He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, and that sentence would be served after he finished his sentence for Cassandra's murder.
30 years. Some people might say that's not enough for taking 2 lives.
It's a tough question, right? Because no amount of prison time can ever truly make up for the loss of a loved one. Sentencing is a complicated issue, and there are so many factors that come into play.
I guess in this case, at least he's going to be behind bars for a very long time.
That's right, and for Dwayne Senior, it was a huge vindication after all those years of suspicion hanging over him.
It just goes to show how damaging wrongful accusations can be. It can take a toll on your reputation, your relationships, everything.
Absolutely. And this case, it really underscores how important it is to keep fighting for justice, even when it seems like all hope is lost. Angela's family, they never gave up, and ultimately they were able to get the answers they deserved.
Angela's brother, Daryl, he said something that really resonated with me. He said that this whole ordeal taught him to cherish every moment with his loved ones and to never take them for granted. And that's something I think we can all take to heart. Life is precious and unpredictable.
It really is.
This case is also a powerful reminder of how far forensic science has come. Without the advancements in DNA technology, who knows if Gary Troutman would have ever been brought to justice for Angela's murder.
It's true. DNA evidence, it's become this incredible tool for solving crimes both new and old. It's giving hope to families who have waited years, sometimes decades, for answers.
It's incredible. So we started this deep dive hoping to unravel the mystery of Angela Savage's murder. And what we found was a story of loss and resilience and ultimately the triumph of justice. But it's also a story that raises some tough questions about our legal system and the way we handle cases like this.
It's a story that makes you think.
It does. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with more captivating stories and expert insights. Until then, stay curious and keep seeking the truth.